But let me turn to what I have to say, which is really about the economic impact of automation and AI. Imagine that 40 years or so ago, someone had invented or had discovered some magic words. You simply said, "Abracadabra, Peter," and you could talk to Peter wherever he was in the world as if he was next door. What would be the economic consequences of that discovery? Well, provided the inventor or discoverer managed to file an effective intellectual property right, she would be by far the richest person on earth. Her intellectual property lawyers would probably end up pretty rich as well, attempting to defend that position. Depending how she liked spending her money, she might make a whole load of fashion designers very rich, and there might be huge numbers of people employed for service staff at her occasional fabulous parties. But in the actual business of her mobile telephony business, nobody would be employed at all, because as I've described this mobile telephony, it's pure magic, so it doesn't need anybody to be employed. Now, the world of mobile phones and computers and apps and artificial intelligence and social media is not pure magic, but it's a lot closer to pure magic than the world of the electromechanical industrial revolution. When General Motors was the most valuable company on earth in terms of equity market value, it employed 1 million people. Google now has an equity market value close to $1 trillion, but employs less than 100,000 people, which is just a drop in the ocean of the global labor market. And that fact you also see in the equity market values in the employees of Netflix or of Facebook, or even more so of small startup high-tech unicorns. And that reflects 3 extraordinary features of information technology and artificial intelligence which make them distinctive from the electromechanical technologies which previously changed our world. The first is the extraordinary pace of hardware progress, with Moore's law telling us that the processing power that we can put on an area of chip, and therefore, in a sense, the processing power that we get per price, doubles every 2 years or so. Now, it may be that Moore's law is slowing down, but it already means that these mobile phones that you just all raised in the air have in them about 120 million times as much processing power as the computers that NASA used to put a man on the moon. Second, even more extraordinary, and this is very relevant to my point about those abracadabra words, the fact that once we have 1 copy of a piece of software, making 10 copies or 1,000 copies or 1 billion copies really doesn't cost us anything at all. And third, the extraordinary power of machine learning, which means that when we want to take a human work activity and automate it, we don't need to laboriously observe exactly how that human work activity occurs and then manually write the code for it. We get the machine, the software, to observe the human activity, and it itself writes the code that automates it. Together, I think that this makes it highly likely that eventually we will automate pretty much everything which counts for current work activity. Pretty much, not all, and I'll come back to some of the exceptions later, but I think the vast majority of what we count as work will ultimately be automatable. Now, it turns out some activities are easier to automate than others, and in some quite surprising ways. Contrary to what many computer scientists believed 60 or 70 years ago, it's turned out to be much easier to automate beating a grandmaster at chess than to automate the actions of a toddler putting soft bricks on top of one another. So, Emma, your baby is still standing out against the computers, even while the greatest grandmaster of chess in the world will lose, even if he or she has an hour to think about each move, and the computer is only allowed a millisecond. But that also means, by the way, that those toddlers' fingers, that one of the things that we find quite difficult to automate at the moment is what are called fine motor skills, the dexterity of fingers feeding soft material through sewing machines in Bangladesh. That is more difficult than back office processing. But I think it's almost certainly just a matter of time before even those fine motor skills can be automated. And even today, in rich developed societies, most work activities could be automated. Analysis by McKinsey suggests that if you look at predictable physical activities where essentially the worker does the same thing again and again and again, 81% of the hours involved in predictable physical activities could already be automated right today with current automation capabilities. 69% of activities involved in processing data, 64% of activities involved in collecting data. And those are activities, those first three categories, which in America account for 51% of all hours worked. And those proportions will undoubtedly increase over time. So, does that mean that we're going to run out of work? Does that mean that in 2100 we'll all be either permanently on the beach or permanently unemployed, or both? Well, I very much doubt it, because as we automate existing work activities, three categories of new activity will continually emerge. Three categories of a slightly different nature and different implications. First, new activities which truly deliver new products and services and which can themselves be automated in a continually progressing process. Now, economists love nice, simple models to think about life. And so I'd like you to think about this life cycle model of how we started off on the process of automation. Once upon a time, 300 years ago, on an island, there were 100 self-sufficient farmers who produced 100 units of food. Somehow they worked out how to have 50 farmers produce 100 units of food, and the other 50 workers went off to go into factories and produce washing machines, autos, or to produce health service, restaurant meals, etc. And in our standard economic models, this is a relentlessly repeatable process in which we have fewer and fewer people in agriculture and they move into manufacturing and services, and then over time, fewer and fewer people in manufacturing and more into services. And that is part of the process that goes on, and that means that we create new things that we truly value. And that process has already taken agriculture across the developed world to only about 2% of employment. And I suspect that by 2050, I very much doubt whether manufacturing will be more than 3 or 4% of global employment. I think we will make all the goods that we need across the world with only 3 or 4%. And we will have a cornucopia of services, many of which will then be subject to an automation process. And in the optimistic point of view, this is always automatable. We can always have more productivity, and we are always creating newly valuable activities. Secondly, however, it is possible that as we automate, what we do is shift people out of the original activity and shift them into face-to-face services which can't be automated. In my simple model, that means that the 50 surplus peasants, as they were, just end up as domestic servants for the 50 productive farmers. And one of the interesting things we actually see in modern economies is a proliferation of very low-paid service jobs, either jobs which we can't automate or which we keep so low-paid that it isn't worth automating them. I give you, for instance, this interesting example of what I call 21st century technology in London. This is a man on a bicycle delivering a pizza. He's not very highly paid, he's self-employed, he's rather precarious, but he's got a job. He can probably be automated, but as long as his wage rate stays low enough, we won't automate that activity. And one of the things we're seeing in rich developed societies is a proliferation of those sets of activities. Third, however, what we may see is that, and we do see already, that as mechanization frees up labor, surplus labor and surplus human energy and ingenuity are devoted to what I would call essentially zero-sum activities. Activities where we're not really creating new goods and services which we truly value, but we're just competing with one another ferociously for a division of the existing economic cake. In the simple model, that means that of our initial 100 farmers, 10 went off to be criminals and 10 went off to be policemen defending the 80 law-abiding citizens against this criminal activity. But I think what's interesting is that when you look at the modern economy and modern work activity, how much of it is essentially zero-sum activity. Now, anybody who is in a business here, who's on a board or in senior management of a business, spends a lot of time now being briefed by your cyber experts about how to defend against cyber criminal attacks. There are a lot of very clever people trying to use cyber capabilities to attack companies. There are lots of equally clever people trying in a sort of endless arms race to defend against them. And all of this, in total, adds nothing to human welfare. It is a zero-sum activity. Or think of all the bad financial selling practices and financial regulators and compliance officers and compensation lawyers, each trying to gain an advantage or stop others getting an unfair advantage. And let me be clear, I speak as a former financial regulator. I think that's a necessary, perfectly legitimate, in some sense rather honourable function in a world where people seek selfish advantage. But it is essentially still a zero-sum activity, in the sense that I'm fairly confident that nobody ever gets up in the morning and says, well, this day is going to be me time. This time I'm really going to enjoy myself. I think I'll go and buy some financial regulatory services. It's not something that really creates value for human life. All political campaigners and lobbying groups arguing for one interest versus another, or even academic economists arguing for one point of view or another. Inevitable activities in a freely competitive and argumentative society, but zero-sum. And if you add up all those sorts of activities, they are a large and a growing share of all activities in rich developed societies. And my prediction is they're going to grow. Indeed, if I roll forward automation to the ultimate limit, I can imagine a world in which almost everything that truly creates human welfare is done by machines, and almost all human work activity is devoted to competing with each other for who gets what share of the product that results. So overall, I suspect that the idea that in 2100 our grandchildren will be sitting around with continual leisure or mass unemployment is overstated. In some way or other, we'll find things to do. But I think the problem we will face is not unemployment, but inequality, for two reasons. First, because at the top end of the income distribution, and we see this already, the infinite replicability of software means that enormous returns accrue to the very, very small number of people who create the key software machinery which runs a lot of the world, or accrue to the people who are lucky enough early on to establish a dominant position. With Mark Zuckerberg essentially massively rich, not because Facebook is necessarily the best social media platform which could be created, but because it was the first, and so originally everybody joined Facebook because everybody joined Facebook in a completely circular process. And this winner-take-all effect, I think interestingly will apply not just in the high-tech world of AI, but also in the high-touch world of celebrity, of sporting prowess, of fashion, or of design, where the ability of people who can capture essentially subjective imagination and convince you that a particular fashion or design is the one that you've got to have, earn enormous amounts of money in the world today. This will be an unequal world, because also at the other end of the income distribution, I think the real wages for those without skills or luck will be held down because many of their jobs will be automated, or they will not be automated only because wages stay low enough to make it not worthwhile automating them. This will be an unequal world, but paradoxically, a high-touch world as well as high-tech, and in a way which will give a further twist to inequality. For in this world of extraordinary high-tech capability, wealth and income will accrue not only to people who have high skills or who own intellectual property rights, but to inherently subjective, high-touch attributes such as subjectively created brands, design, beauty, sporting prowess. But above all, wealth will attach to the most physical thing of all, land in specific locations. Consider this odd paradox. We talk about information communications technology, the death of distance, telecommuting possible across the world. But if you were to look at the breakdown of total wealth in the world, all the wealth that people own, and break it down by categories, what do you find? You find that by far the biggest category is real estate, that the relative importance of real estate has increased very greatly over the last 50 years, and that almost all the value in urban real estate does not lie in the constructed building, but on the land on which the building sits. And that wealth is concentrated increasingly in the world's leading and successful cities where talented people congregate, in London, New York, San Francisco, LA, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and of course, above all, in Melbourne, the world Intellectual Community of the Year 2018, as I now know, a fact that I will take back to Britain. Now, why is that? Why do these successful cities grow and have such huge property values? It's because in an ICT, an information and technology intensive world, high talent people tend to cluster in economically dominant locations, and I think they are going to continue to do so as long as some work activities cannot be automated, and I think that will mean forever. And second, because as automation makes many goods and services ever cheaper, better off people devote, and it's a perfectly rational thing to do, devote an increasing percentage of all their income to living in the places where they can have successful lives and to enjoying the benefit of the property in the nice part of town rather than the less nice part of town, because after all, what else are they going to do with their money? I mean, there is a limit to how many washing machines most of us want to own. For me, it's one. I have no desire to have 2 or 3, but there's a limitless desire to compete for other people for locational specific real estate, which gives a further twist to inequality, which is the prices in prime cities and locations become only affordable to the unbelievably successful or to the children of the unbelievably successful. A world of limitless automation potential will probably be very unequal in income and wealth terms by skill level, by geography, and by luck. So, finally, what to do to gain the benefits of this world of limitless automation capability while limiting the downsides? 4 quick thoughts on income, wealth, geography, and social values. Income. We will have to take seriously the issue of distribution. We will live in a world where we cannot rely on free markets to ensure that everybody enjoys real wages and real incomes enough to make them, as it were, equal citizens of society. Issues such as universal basic income or the provision of crucial social goods, be they education, be they health, or even be they property, will be vitally important. Second, wealth. Karl Marx was fundamentally right in his analysis of the self-reinforcing tendency of capitalism to produce ever-increasing wealth inequality. Because essentially, richer people can afford to save more, And because they save more, they accumulate wealth while poorer people don't. And if they hand it on, they accumulate that even more. That relentless tendency to inequality, which is inherent within capitalism, was only offset by the rise of universal suffrage and social democratic distribution. Without that, it would have gone on. And it is going to get more intense. We will have to think about what we do think is the approach to inheritance, to wealth taxes, to property taxes. But we shouldn't just address this issue of huge disparities of property prices and wealth holding by simply a taxation approach. We also, and this is the issue about geography, we need to think really carefully about the economic geography of the future. One of the most startling facts in the world today is the division between the successful city and the less successful small town. And if you look at where the Brexit votes come from and the Trump votes come from and where Marine Le Pen's votes come from in France, they come from the unsuccessful small town. We have got to think about what it is that we do about transportation systems, about urban design, about the way that we assist economic development, which stop geographies as well as people being left behind. And finally, social values and meaning. We have got to think about those jobs which either will never be automated or we don't want to automate them, and we've got to cherish them. In Japan, a lot of effort is going into humanoid robots which will do social care of the elderly. I have to say, I don't want to go in that direction. I think social care of the elderly should be done by human beings. But at least in the UK, and I somewhat suspect it might be here in Australia, social care of the elderly is done by people being paid very low wages. Because what we do is we put it out to competitive tender and we drive down the price. We have got to have a different attitude to that. We've got to think about the jobs which only humans can do or which humans will do best, and we have to cherish them and value them, whether that be social care or whether it be all sorts of craft activities, physical activities. And we also, I believe, have to value activities and education and skills for their own sake, not because instrumentally they drive an increase in productivity. We have to cherish art and music for their own sake as well as for any economic benefit they will have. Amid all the talk of artificial intelligence, perhaps the most important thing is to cherish and value all the things that make us distinctively human.